Alaska, we're going north, the rush is on.
This is a film about a visit to Alaska. After flying across Canada, we flew up the west coast to Alaska. West of Calgary, the Rocky Mountains arise out of the prairies, and soon we were flying over the famous resort town of Banff. Fortunately, we had clear weather and so were afforded excellent views of the large Pacific Northwest volcanoes and the coastal range with its mountains covered by glaciers. After a brief stop in Vancouver, we flew north to Alaska following the Pacific West Coast, but there was heavy cloud obscuring the view. Coming into land at Juneau, we flew over cruise ships which congregate in its downtown port while supplying the inside passage. Surprisingly, Juneau, with a population of only 32,000 people, is the capital city of Alaska. There are no roads connecting the city to the rest of Alaska, nor to the rest of North America. The only access is via air or sea. The biennial festival called The Celebration was on. It brings together coastal Indian people, some of whom wore beautiful garb and headdress. During the cruise ship season, up to 5 large cruise ships dock at Juneau each day. They stay for about 10 hours and disgorge some 6,000 passengers into the area. There is a large industry to service the requirements of these passengers, including seaplane flights, helicopter flights, sightseeing boats, and an aerial tramway that takes tours 600 meters up Mount Roberts right from the cruise ship dock. Wings Airways offers cruise ship passengers a 40-minute flight-seeing adventure over 5 glaciers that flow out of the massive Juneau ice field. Conveniently, the seaplanes pick up and drop off passengers right at the cruise ship docks while the cruise ships are in port. Hence, the seaplanes are regularly coming and going. The seaplanes are de Havilland Otters that were built in the 1950s and 60s in Toronto, and in the early 2000s they were upgraded from 600 horsepower radial engines to more powerful 900 horsepower turbine engines. It was fascinating to watch the seaplanes take off and land amongst the giant cruise ships at anchor. In a scene from the 1930s, a parade of 10 bush planes slowly passed overhead on their way to landing at the Juneau airport. There are several helicopter companies that offer cruise ship passengers flights over the Juneau ice field, including landing on the Glacier and a dog sled experience with mushers from the Iditarod race. These helicopters are coming and going all day long when the cruise ships are in Juneau. The Mendenhall Glacier is 22 kilometers long and only about 19 kilometers from downtown Juneau, so it's routinely visited by cruise ship passengers. The beautiful Steller's jay is the provincial bird of British Columbia. Nugget Falls is formed by the Nugget Creek that comes off the Nugget Glacier. It's an impressive waterfall that drops a total of 115 meters onto a sandbar in Mendenhall Lake. The kayakers near the face of the Mendenhall showed its huge size. The Mendenhall is retreating and shrinking, and is expected that the glacier's face will soon pull out of the Mendenhall Lake. With the coming of evening, the cruise ships recovered their passengers and prepared to leave to continue their voyage up the Inside Passage to Skagway. Controversially, cruise ship passenger fees were used to cover the $10 million cost of a new waterfront park and seawalk and reflecting pool, where an impressive $3 million life-size breaching humpback whale sculpture was installed in 2016 beside the Douglas Bridge. The well-lit cruise ships departing in the darkness looked particularly beautiful as they sailed out on the Gastineau Channel. The Juneau Ferry Terminal for the Alaska Marine Highway System is on Oak Bay, which is about 15 kilometers outside of Juneau. To get to the start point of the LSEC trip in Haines, I booked passage on the MV Fairweather, which is a fast catamaran ferry in the Alaska Marine Highway System. After exiting Oak Bay, the MV Fairweather came up to a speed of some 30 knots, so the 127 kilometer trip only took 2.25 hours. At the Haines ferry terminal, some of the passengers and vehicles departed, with the remainder staying on for Skagway. Haines is a small isolated town of 1,700 people with a road connection to Canada. Haines' small downtown has some interesting stores and sites, including a hammer museum. Its port is full of fishing boats. Fort Seward, adjacent to Haines, was named in honor of William H. Seward, the United States Secretary of State who arranged the purchase of Alaska from Russia in 1867 for the price of $7.2 million. Fort Seward, a former United States Army installation, was completed in 1904. It was the only United States Army post in Alaska before World War II, and it served as a rest and recreation center for troops who served in the North Pacific Theater. The fort was deactivated in 1946 and its deterioration commenced then. The Helsingland Hotel is in the former Fort Seward commanding officer's quarters, so my room contained many old period pieces. By air, it's 900 kilometers from Juneau to Anchorage. Northwest of Juneau, the clouds vanished, and there were magnificent views of the Pacific Coast Ranges, including the giant Mount St. Elias and Mount Logan. The huge glaciers descending to the ocean attract the cruise ships, which were easily viewable from 35,000 feet. At Anchorage, for the first time, I could look down on the fascinating scene of an airplane coming into land. The Anchorage International Airport is the world's third busiest airport for cargo traffic. This traffic is strongly linked to Anchorage's location on the Great Circle route between Asia and the lower 48 states. The Lake Hood Seaplane Base near the International Airport is the world's busiest seaplane base. There are some 800 aircraft based there. As 90% of Alaska is not served by roads, aviation is the state's major form of transportation. Anchorage, with a population of some 300,000 residents, is Alaska's most populous city and contains more than 40% of the state's population. At 61 degrees north, it lies slightly further north than Oslo, Stockholm, Helsinki, and St. Petersburg, but not as far north as Reykjavik or Murmansk. At times, Denali can be seen in the distance. Elmendorf Air Force Base, located just north of Anchorage, is the home to United States Air Force fighters and transport aircraft. It was fascinating to watch these aircraft take off and land. The day's exercise started off with AWACS and refueling aircraft taking off, followed by F-16 and F-22 fighters. The F-16 Fighting Falcon is a single-engine, multi-role, all-weather fighter aircraft. Over 4,500 of these aircraft have been built since 1976. The F-22 Raptor is a fifth-generation all-weather stealth air superiority fighter. The last one was delivered to the United States Air Force in 2012. At the end of the exercise, 3 fighter aircraft lit their afterburners high overhead and sped off into the distance. The aircraft's return to Elmendorf signaled the end of the exercise. The Hernandez Sports Fish Hatchery produces over 6 million salmon and trout a year that are released throughout the region. The Alaska Wild Berries Product Store is a chocoholic's dream with its 6-meter-high chocolate fall and its candy kitchen making chocolate-covered cookies. Petroleum is Anchorage's most visible industry, with many high-rises bearing the logos of large multinational oil companies such as BP and ConocoPhillips. The field operations of these companies are mainly located on Alaska's North Slope. The headquarters building of ConocoPhillips Alaska is also the tallest building in Alaska. Downtown Anchorage has a number of attractive murals painted on the side of buildings. There are lots of beautiful, colorful flowers to be seen around Anchorage. The Anchorage Museum has an interesting collection of exhibits that explore the land, the peoples, the art, and the history of Alaska. The Alaska Railroad, which extends from Seward on the Kenai Peninsula in the south to just past Fairbanks in the north, is a modest railroad with just some 800 kilometers of track. The railroad is quite popular with cruise boat tourists who go from the giant cruise ships to visit Denali National Park. Near Resolution Park, the Nick Arm of the Cook Inlet had ships coming and going. Resolution Park on Cook Inlet has a statue of Captain Cook, the great 18th century explorer who in 1778 explored the area before unsuccessfully attempting to traverse the Northwest Passage back to England. The sunset from Resolution Park was a spectacular display of reds, oranges, and purples. Leaving Anchorage, it was a 2-hour drive north to Talkeetna for a flight to Denali. On the way, I passed through the city of Wasilla, which Sarah Palin was once the mayor of. There were many interesting scenes on the road to Talkeetna. The Talkeetna Business District is full of quaint buildings. Denali, formerly known as Mount McKinley, is the highest mountain peak in North America, with a summit elevation of 6,190 meters. In the native languages of the area, Denali means the tall one. The sightseeing tour from Talkeetna to Denali lasted 2 hours and included a glacier landing in the Don Sheldon Amphitheater at the head of the Ruth Glacier. The Talkeetna Airport is the major airstrip for sightseeing trips to Denali. At takeoff, the weather was sketchy, so as we neared the Alaska Range, the clouds obscured the top of Denali from view. That being said, there were still many impressive glaciers and mountainsides on view from the plain. We landed in the vast Sheldon Amphitheater on the source of the Ruth Glacier. We had 20 minutes to enjoy the views before it was time to take off from the glacier for the return flight to the Talkeetna airport. Returning to Talkeetna at 9 p.m., there was still plenty of light to drive northwards to Denali National Park. The sunset at midnight over the Jack River was spectacular. There are many interesting sites along Highway 3 leading to Denali National Park. As the National Park Service does not allow visitors to drive private cars into the park past the 14-mile mark, I took an early morning park shuttle bus to the Eelson Visitor Center to visit a bit of Denali National Park and hopefully see some of its animals. The round trip to the Eelson Visitor Center, located at mile 66 on the park road, took some 8 hours. There were a surprising number of Dall sheep along the park road due to the abundance of food at that time of year. The Denali caribou herd has declined from 20,000 animals during the 1920s to its current size of 1,800 animals. While the colorful foothills were pretty, unfortunately the low cloud deck cut off viewing of the Alaska Range peaks. The cow moose with her calf were difficult to see in the distant bush. The willow ptarmigans had changed their white winter plumage for their drab summer plumage. As the determined cyclist pedaled uphill, on the other side of the hill was a grizzly bear sow with her 2 cubs feeding just off the road. Grizzly bears are omnivores, eating a mixed diet of grasses, berries, roots, fishes, small mammals, and the occasional caribou or moose and their calves. A female can have 1 to 3 cubs, which will stay with her for up to 3.5 years. However, the cub survival rate in Denali is only 35%. The many colors of the rock at Polychrome Pass are pretty, but the highlight is meeting another bus coming along the narrow road that snakes across the pass. After some 4 hours, we arrived at the Eelson Visitor Center, which is famous for its amazing views of Denali on a clear day. Unfortunately, it wasn't a clear day, so Denali remained hidden from our view. Apparently, there is less than a 50% chance of visitors seeing the Denali Mountain. Despite not seeing Denali, this bus trip into Denali National Park was very rewarding. Back down south lies the scenic Kenai Peninsula. Turnagain Arm is a branch of the Cook Inlet south of Anchorage. It was named by William Bligh of HMS Bounty fame when he was serving as the sailing master on Captain Cook's 3rd and final voyage of discovery between 1776 and 1779. I spent a night at the Alyeska Resort. It is the largest ski area in Alaska, but as this was summer, there was only hiking on offer. The grounds of the resort were quite pretty. The highlight of the stay was a 617-meter scenic ride on the Alyeska Aerial Tram to the upper station, which is at 711 meters. From the upper station, one can see for miles in all directions, including views down to Glacier Creek and out over Turnagain Arm and the endless peaks of the Chugach mountain range. A steep hike up the snowfield brought us to the Glacier Bowl. The red snow algae was interesting. The Alaska Wildlife Conservation Center is a nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving Alaska's wildlife by providing refuge for orphaned, injured, and ill animals that can't survive in the wild on their own. Portage Lake is a glacial lake in the Chugach National Forest that sits in a long, heavily glaciated valley. Portage Lake has only become visible since 1914 due to the rapid retreat of the Portage Glacier. Hundreds of years ago, the glacier filled the entire 23-kilometer-long Portage Valley, but now there are 5 separate glaciers that feed into the lake. Seward is a town with a population of 2,600 and has links going back to the Russian fur trade post established there in 1793. Just before sunrise, the Seward small boat harbor is active with the departure of tour and sport fishing boats heading out onto Resurrection Bay. It was surprising to see a seal caught up and tossed around in a boat's wake. The Seward Waterfront Park has many RV campsites.
Finally today, biologists are working to figure out why berries in Kodiak have been coming out considerably earlier the last 2 years and how bears might be affected by that change. Berry season is peaking closer to the salmon run.
Whilst listening to the local news, it was fascinating to watch the trumpeter swans. Seward shipyard across Resurrection Bay from the town was the scene of an urgent repair to a fishing boat that was missing out on the fishing season. With the repair complete, it was interesting to watch the marine Travelift pick up and carry the fishing boat back to the ocean so that it could return to the fishing grounds.
So you're a city employee? Oh yeah.
Chum salmon was abundant in the bay. Nearby Seward is the easily accessible Exit Glacier. During the short hike up to the Exit Glacier, there are signs marking where the foot of the glacier has been through recent times to illustrate its recession. Between 2013 and 2014, the glacier's foot retreated approximately 57 meters. The Exit Glacier was one of the landmarks that President Obama visited during his trip to Alaska in 2015 to highlight the effects of climate change and how it affects Alaska's coastal glaciers. At the foot of the glacier, there is a warning sign about it being an icefall hazard zone. However, given the gentle slope of this receding glacier, this warning appears overblown. Alaska is an interesting place to visit, especially if you like the great outdoors. It's 420 kilometers from Anchorage to Fairbanks by air. It's always impressive to pass by another jetliner with a combined closing speed of some 1,700 kilometers per hour. Coming into land at Fairbanks under the midnight sun, we flew over the Tanana River, which is a 940 kilometer long tributary of the mighty Yukon River. For Fairbanks, midnight is a popular time for aircraft arrivals and early morning for subsequent departures. An area at the Fairbanks Airport is home to an amazing boneyard of aircraft, mainly from the 50s and 60s. The most interesting aircraft in the boneyard was the C-119 flying boxcar with the jet pod on top. These planes were used for forest firefighting. Sadly, there was a 1968 Ford Mustang rotting away in front of a 1957 Douglas DC-6 aircraft. There was an interesting graveyard of former U.S. Army flying banana helicopters. Everett Air has a boneyard of DC-6s to supply spares for their in-service DC-6s. An Everett DC-6 fuel tanker that was manufactured in 1957 was preparing to take off. The DC-6 airless flammable and hazardous materials throughout Alaska. As a bulk fuel tanker, a DC-6 can carry up to 5,000 gallons. Served as President Harry S. Truman's personal aircraft when he was in office in the 40s and 50s. Passengers from Alaskan cruise ships filled the Discovery 3 stern-wheel riverboat on the Chena River. At the start of their riverboat trip, the passengers got to see a float plane taking off on the Chena River. The Discovery 3 riverboat was built in Washington State in 1987. After being barged north to Alaska, it traveled 1,600 kilometers up the Yukon River to Fairbanks. The riverboat's wake was surprisingly big when it hit the shoreline. The valley of the Goldstream Creek just north of Fairbanks has been almost continuously mined since 1903. The tailings are processed for gravel, which makes for interesting viewing for those who enjoy seeing heavy equipment in operation. Nearby is the historic Trans-Alaska Pipeline, completed in 1977, which snakes almost 1,300 kilometers across Alaska. There is a mixture of nature and abandoned equipment in the area, including the impressive Letourneau snow train from the 1950s. Alaska Freight Lines of Seattle used the snow train to deliver 500 tons of equipment to the Dew Line radar stations being built in northern Alaska. Speaking of northern Alaska, on the way to Eielson Air Force Base, I passed through North Pole, Alaska, which is surprisingly located south of Fairbanks. I was lucky that when I stopped by Eielson Air Force Base, Red Flag Alaska was in progress on the huge Joint Pacific-Alaska Range Complex. This 2-week multinational exercise is meant to provide realistic combat experience to pilots. Because of Red Flag Alaska, I was able to see Japanese aerial refueling tankers and a wide variety of U.S. Air Force aircraft that were based in the United States, Japan, and South Korea. The A-10 close support aircraft of the 25th Fighter Squadron based in Osan Air Force Base, South Korea were impressive as they took off whilst I listened to the car radio.
Yard and property of those pesky mosquitoes with their child and pet friendly treatment, and it's 100% guaranteed. Go mosquito free. Take back your summer for only $60. Mosquito can also spray for your special events with a
The arrival of a giant C-17 from Seward Air National Guard Base in New York State was a pleasant surprise. The F-16 fighters, painted in non-US style camouflage patterns, belong to the 18th Aggressor Squadron. This squadron uses flying styles and abilities of foreign air forces in order to train United States Air Force pilots against realistic opposition. The number of F-16 fighter aircraft taxiing to the marshalling area at the south end of the runway prior to takeoff was impressive. The F-16s taxied past aerial tankers of the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force that were participating in Red Flag Alaska. Finally, the F-16 started taking off one after the other on afterburner. After an hour and a half, the A-10 started returning to base and landing. The A-10 was built around a massive 30mm 7-barrel Gatling gun that can fire nearly 70 rounds a second. Even though I was watching the activity on the base from a public highway, an air policeman pulled up and asked me to leave, so I returned to Fairbanks. Fairbanks, on the banks of the Chena River, was founded in 1901. It has a population of 33,000 people, making it the second largest city in Alaska after Anchorage. Unfortunately, the smoke from nearby forest fires drifted into Fairbanks, reddening the sky and making it slightly unpleasant to breathe. Downtown Fairbanks is a blend of old and new, with historic buildings dating back to the Gold Rush days. In the depth of the northern winter, the Yukon Quest, a 1,000-mile international dog sled race, is run between Fairbanks, Alaska, and Whitehorse in the Yukon. A trip to Alaska is better if you get out on a trip deep into the wilderness. Such trips include one down the Alyeska River to the Pacific Ocean and another one down the Hula Hula River to the Arctic Ocean.
Take me somewhere nice.